maybe we should go ahead and get into these postmodern principles and themes here, which the authors kind of they lay out, and then in each chapter, when they go into each kind of sub social justice discipline, they kind of make a point of showing how each one instantiates these principles and themes. And I think it's, I don't know, fairly clear, fairly plausible, to the point where once I got a few chapters into that, I started thinking, okay, there's really nothing new here. I mean, by the time I got to the feminism and gender and then the fat and disability studies, it started feeling like the same old thing happening over again in these new areas. There's these two postmodern principles. The first one is radical skepticism about the ability to know anything, and cultural constructivism, which they call the postmodern knowledge principle. Mm-hmm. And then the second one is what they call the postmodern political principle, which is that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies which decide what and how things can be known. So obviously the second principle kind of refers back to the first in a way. They're both really concerned with knowledge at a deep level. And Foucault uses the term power knowledge, power hyphen knowledge, to refer to this. And then that kind of goes into these four postmodern themes, which I'll just go through quickly, and then maybe we can discuss them individually a little bit. The blurring of boundaries, meaning that categories are inherently oppressive because they are based on these power relations and not things that we can actually know for certain about reality. The power of language, meaning that basically the very grammar of a language can control, oppress, assault us, and yet words don't actually refer to things, but only to other words. So real knowledge and communication are impossible. Language is essentially an act. It is something you do rather than something that you know or say. It's all kind of reduced to action. Cultural relativism, everything is constructed, and truth transcending that constructed context is, if not non-existent, then at the very least inaccessible. And that means that basically people's evaluation of cultures can only be judged by the way that they instantiate power relations. And then finally, loss of the individual and the universal, which is kind of interesting and paradoxical. So basically the idea is that individuals are constructed by the forces around them, and the universal is a fiction that's constructed to kind of dominate the non-existent individual. So there's no individual, there's no universal humanity. There's only kind of what the authors describe as localized sets of people who have the same power interests. So those are the basic principles that they're tracing through various academic fields and political movements throughout the book.
You know, one of the things that I like the most about this book, I think where it's really useful, is in making all that stuff quite clear. And I think you're right. By the time you're getting through sort of the fifth or the sixth particular instantiation of what they call capital T theory, right, which just kind of comes out of the French experience. It feels like, I've heard this story before. But I think that's also a strength in some way, because they've reinforced their point enough that I think the reader has really kind of internalized it by then. And I think it is really important, even though it's amazingly abstract in lots of ways, right? For them to focus on postmodernism as, right, an epistemology, right, as a way of knowing and a theory of knowledge and how one knows anything. It can be really easy for somebody to just kind of their eyes glaze over. Whoa, I'm just not interested in that kind of thing. But what they do, I think, is they show the really important implications of this, because if all knowledge is situational, therefore there is no such thing as universal knowledge. There is no such thing as objectivity. They talk a lot, Lindsay and Pluckrose, about postmodernism, skepticism, and even now attacks on science. Science is just one way of knowing, and it's no more or less valid than, for example, witchcraft. And they mention that in the book, and it's true that there are those people in these postmodern ideologies that believe these kinds of things. And it's all kind of comes back to what they talk about as those two core principles, right? The knowledge and power, which I think, as you helpfully pointed out for Foucault, those are just flip sides of the same coin. Anybody who claims to be a knower is exercising power over others. And for the postmodernists, power itself is corrupt. Power itself is oppressive. There's no positive use of power in the world. At least in the way that certainly once we get to the activists, everything that has to do with power is bad, it's negative, it needs to be eradicated. And so much of that comes down to that very early beginnings in the radical skepticism about anything that you might call the real world and our ability to access it.
Yeah, and I think that makes this book helpful in this way, that somebody who can see what's wrong with these principles, but has a tendency to be naive about some contemporary political movements. For example, perhaps I think there are probably people in the Catholic world who it's easy for them to see the kind of dangerous radicalism of these approaches to gender because they're so uncompromising in their blurring of boundaries. And their deliberate incoherence might be a little bit more potentially drawn in by some of these approaches to race, which use a lot of the same discussions of power dynamics and knowledge, but keep a little bit more of a set of boundaries in terms of differentiating different races and cultures and things like that. So there's still some sense of reality there. I think that it's easy for some people, well-meaning people, to be drawn in by a certain way of analyzing power dynamics, as long as it keeps a reality to kind of analyze. And I think that when you take a look at how these are a manifestation of this very radical philosophy that really reduces everything to these dynamics, I think that maybe that would help some people see the issues with, why is it, what's the problem when somebody says check your privilege? It's obviously a concept that has some validity. Same with intersectionality. The core concept of this has some validity. And yet the way they're used seem totally reductive in terms of reducing everything to power and oppression. And I think when you look at how it's laid out explicitly in the academic origins of these movements, it's easier to see what's poisonous about them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so much of the work that the activist versions of postmodernism do is take groups that we think exist, or maybe we don't think exist, but we've come to believe that they exist through significant reasons because of the activists, right, who have convinced us that such and such group exists. And in particular, because the postmodernists believe so deeply in the power of language to construct really everything. I mean, if you go down the queer theory route, everything is. I mean, there's no such thing as the material world, at least that has any influence or any importance on human beings. And so everything becomes socially constructed. Obviously, it's true that some things are socially constructed, right? There's no particular reason why, hair length has this relationship with gender, and men have short hair and women have long hair in certain societies. It's not the way it is. So some of those things are true, but they're true in kind of trivial ways. What the postmodern ideologies try to do is say that everything is socially constructed. And so therefore there really is no such thing as nature for example. There is no such thing as human nature. And these are the kinds of things that they're very happy to say if you just simply sit down and read them. And so I think it is easy to be lulled into a sense that, well, this just kind of sounds like civil rights movement, or this sounds like, some kind of broader sense of faithfulness to the 14th Amendment or whatever it is. These are movements that want to convince us that there is no such thing as nature, that there is only power in the world, and that their goal is, they say, to eradicate power. But the way they're going to eradicate power is by using power. And I think the analogy that I thought of when reading parts of this book was the way that this is probably something that most listeners will know. They've probably learned it in school. Woodrow Wilson gets the United States into World War I in 1917, and he says this is the war to end all wars. We will have a war against war, and therefore we will use the means of war to destroy war, and then we will have war no more. In a sense, that's what we have from critical theories. We will use power to destroy power. And as we all know, Woodrow Wilson completely failed in destroying war. And in the same way, these critical theories are and will completely fail in trying to eradicate power from the world.
So it's very interesting even in these initial principles and themes going back to the 60s, how much of the rhetoric of social justice is present in them. So, the idea that categories are oppressive, certainly you can see that in the area of gender above all, because other, in a sense, intersectionality doubles down on categories and kind of goes in the opposite direction in some way with that in the area of race. But then this idea of language oppressing us, we hear now very commonly about words being violence. We hear about, basically in the kind of the power moves that activists use, where if you disagree with them, that's evidence. If you say you're not racist, that's evidence of being racist, for example, kind of speaks to this idea that words are always part of a power game of some kind. There's also this bit from Derrida, if that's how you pronounce him, that's mentioned in the book, which is that he says that the speaker's meaning does not have more weight than the listener's interpretation. And so one of the imports of that is that if you take offense at something that I say, I can't tell you, no, you misinterpreted what I was saying. That's not what I was saying. And this has come down to us very clearly. I mean, this is something that I've heard people say, hey, if someone tells you they're offended by something you said, you can't say that it wasn't offensive, or you can't say, you're not listening to them, or you're failing in empathy if you say, actually, this is not what I meant. So that's very clear. Even that kind of very crude behavior that people engage in is right here in these first principles. Likewise with the check your privilege idea, where the idea that you can't evaluate your own culture or other people's cultures objectively, or actually people who are lower on the power totem pole can evaluate cultures, but the people who are higher on the totem pole can't do so, I guess, in practice.